Season 4 of How We Win is here.
For the past 4 years, we've been making history in critical elections all over the country. And last year, we made history again by expanding our majority in the Senate, beating election-denying Republicans in crucial state house races, and fighting back a non-existent red wave.
But the MAGA Republicans who plotted and pardoned the attempted overthrow of our government now control the House, thanks to gerrymandered maps and repressive anti-voter laws. And the chaotic spectacle we've already seen shows us just how far they will go to seize power, dismantle our government, and take away our freedoms.
So, the official podcast of The Persistence is back with Season 4. There's so much more important work ahead of us to fight for equity, justice, and our very democracy itself. We'll take you behind the lines and inside the rooms where it happens with strategy and inspiration from progressive changemakers all over the country.
And we'll dig deep into the weekly news that matters most and what you can do about it with messaging and communications expert, co-founder of Way to Win, and our new co-host, Jennifer Fernandez-Ancona.
So join Steve and I every Wednesday for your weekly dose of inspiration, action, and hope.
I'm Steve Pearson.
And I'm Jennifer Fernandez-Ancona.
And this is How We Win.
I signed an order appointing Jack Smith.
And nobody knows you.
And those who say Jack is a fanatic.
Mr. Smith is a veteran career prosecutor.
Wait, what law have I broken?
The events leading up to and on January 6th, classified documents and other presidential records.
You understand what prison is?
Send me to jail.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Jack, the only podcast to get all the special counsel news in one place. It is Sunday, December 18th. I'm Allison Gill.
And I'm Andy McCabe. And this week, wow, we've seen an avalanche of subpoenas from the special counsel's office. It began with subpoenas to election officials in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona, and then expanded to Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and now New Mexico, all states that, for those of you who are following along, you will remember were part of the post-2020 election efforts to overturn the results. So these subpoenas hit also some secretaries of state, and we're going to go over those and just what they're asking for in just a few minutes.
Yep, and we'll also cover the contempt motion filed against Donald in the documents case that was rejected by Chief Judge Beryl Howell and what that says about the investigation, as well as the official dismissal of the order issued by Judge Eileen Cannon appointing a special master, along with the Trump civil suit, which she had to dismiss as well. And last week, Andy, we posited that the Save America PAC would likely fall under special counsel purview. It was previously under criminal investigation. We were kind of like, that feels like it should go up under his umbrella.
It does.
And CNN confirmed it this week. It does. And we'll talk about that. And finally, I have some questions about the special counsel warrant application to access the data from a congressional rep's phone. That's Scott Perry's phone. I'm calling it, Andrew, the search warrant two-step. We've seen it in a few. We've seen it in a few of these seizures of phones, like Eastman, Clark, Lindell, where they get the warrant to get the phone and then they image it and then they get the warrant to get the additional stuff. It's like this extra step, and I'll ask you about that.
Absolutely. And we're going to be talking to two of the authors of the Just Security Model Prosecution Memo for the Documents case. Andrew Weissmann, NYU law professor, longtime prosecutor, member of special counsel Mueller's team, and of course, a former general counsel of the FBI. And Andrew's partner, Ryan Goodman, is also an NYU law professor. He's the co-editor-in-chief of Just Security, and he's the former special counsel to the general counsel of the Department of Defense.
Yeah. Wow. So already we have a huge show. We're already just, 3 minutes into it, just talking about what we're going to talk about. So it's going to be a lot. And, I was worried, Andrew, when we started this, is there going to be enough special prosecutor news to put together a whole thing? Yes.
Yeah, so far, no problems in that category.
Totally not. And also, I'd like to tell everyone there will be episodes of Jack on Christmas and New Year's, so you can look forward to that. Let's start Because the first half of the show, we're going to focus on the January 6th investigation. Second half of the show, we're going to look at the documents investigation. Let's start with the subpoena party and the January 6th fraudulent elector scheme. And I feel like I'm about to start that Rock Me Amadeus song, where
oh my God, you did not just go to Rock Me Amadeus.
Tuesday, December 6th, Donna election officials in Dane County and Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, Wayne County, Michigan, and Maricopa County, Arizona confirmed receipt of subpoenas. Dun, dun. Thursday, December 8th, 2 days later, Secretaries of State in Michigan and Arizona confirmed receipt of subpoenas. Monday, December 12th, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, under a new grand jury number, by the way, and Clark County, Nevada Election Division confirmed they were subpoenaed. And finally, Tuesday, December 13th, the next day, officials in New Mexico confirmed that they received subpoenas.
That is right. And what we know about those subpoenas is they all look exactly the same. I guess one way to characterize them, really without even getting the details, is huge, broad, massive. So here's what the subpoenas actually asked for. And I'll quote some of this. For the period of June 1st, 2020 through January 20th, 2021, produce any and all communications in any form. Okay, so that's recorded calls, emails, text messages, whatever, from or involving Donald J. Trump for president here and after the campaign, Donald J. Trump, or any employee or agent of or attorney for the Trump campaign. So this is a very, very broad request for communications from the list of people I'm going to give you, connecting to really anything having to do with Donald Trump, his campaign, or any of the people working for his campaign.
Yeah, and Andrew, you're going to go over the list of those to, from, et cetera. But we had a lot of questions. I put a whole thread on who all these people were, if you want to check that out on Twitter at Mueller, She Wrote. But a lot of people are like, where's Ginny Thomas? And I think it's important to note that she isn't Trump campaign, Donald Trump, or an employee or agent of or attorney for the Trump campaign. So she would be subpoenaed for these things, not in the list of things that they're looking for communications for, if that makes sense. I just sort of wanted to touch on that because people are like, where's Ginny? So that's what's happening there.
That's absolutely right. So the subpoenas are actually targeted at individuals who may have been in contact or had communications with anyone that fits that description that I just gave you. And that list of people starts out with my favorite name of the whole list, which is Kenneth Cheesebro. I don't know why I just like that. And then includes Justin Clark, Joe DiGenova, John Eastman, Jenna Ellis, Boris Epstein, Rudolph Giuliani, Bernard Kerik, Bruce Marks, Cleta Mitchell, Matthew Morgan, Kurt Olson, William Olson, Stefan Passatino, Sidney Powell, William, aka Bill Stepien, Victorious Tozing, James Trupus, and L. Lynn Wood Jr. So that is a heck of a list of people who we really know just from the reporting that we've all seen over the last year or so. These are folks who were involved, played some role in the lead up to January 6th, planning of events, discussions of potential, now we think of them as potential crimes, right? The electors issues, the congressional issues, all kinds of stuff like that. So definitely a wide swath here. So if I could, Allison, just for a second, I want to talk about what this means from a investigator's point of view.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to remember that the legal standard for a subpoena is very, very low. It's a simple relevance standard. So U.S. attorneys working with a grand jury can essentially send subpoenas out to whoever and for whatever they want. Subpoenas can be, if you object to them and go to court and try to fight to not have to comply with it, they can be quashed, as they say in the legal world, which means exactly what it sounds like,
or
smashed.
Curtailed. They can be like, the scope can be less, made less right. Broad. We've seen this happen a million times with all the January 6th subpoenas.
That's right. But typically to do that, you've got to be able to show that the subpoena was in fact overbroad or irrelevant or for some reason improper. And that's pretty tough to do because prosecutors have such a wide latitude. That being said, as an investigator, subpoenas are usually like 1.0 investigative step, right? It's one of the first things you do when you're starting a big conspiracy type investigation like this. And what you're doing with a broad subpoena is you're essentially trying to define the outer limits of people who might be involved in this network or this group of co-conspirators. Sometimes negative results can be just as important to you. So let's say, Joe Johnson was on that list I just gave you, and he responds to the subpoena indicating that he has no communications responsive to this request. That's actually a good thing for investigators because they can then write that person off and say, okay, Joe Johnson wasn't really, a central member in this thing here. We don't have to waste any more time on him. So it is kind of a way of ruling people in and ruling people out. Now, that being said, as a kind of a typical initial step in an investigation, it does raise some legitimate questions about why DOJ is just sending these subpoenas out now. However, it is also common that once you've done some investigating and talked to some witnesses and found some things out, you then have to send out another whole round of broad subpoenas because you're following up on investigative development. So I don't think we can draw too many conclusions here other than I think the new regime, Jack Smith and the team he's put together, they are making an effort to be very expansive to make sure they've swept up every single thing that's relevant.
Yeah, and we're going to talk in a little bit about something very one aspect of this entire thing, which is Rep. Scott Perry's phone. And we found out that going back to May, they have been trying to prioritize getting communications with that particular congressperson and how that leads to another search warrant, which leads to another search warrant, which then leads to analyzing and gathering the information, which leads to, we have some more questions about communications with some folks that we see right here that have been copied maybe on emails. And we're going to ask you specifically to hand those over too. But we probably already have them, so don't mess with us. So that is always an excellent question, though, like what took so long. But something else that came out, a really great Caitlin Polance report from CNN about additional questions. We covered the scope of this investigation in a previous episode of Jack, and we got some more information. We got some news about it. And so last week, I asked you, Andrew, if the ongoing investigation into Trump's Save America PAC, it's been under investigation for like 10 months now, would be part of the special counsel investigations. And we posited that it probably is, and CNN confirmed that this week. Here's a quote from CNN. Top prosecutor J.P. Cooney, the former head of public corruption in the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, is overseeing a significant financial probe that Smith will now become part of his office. The probe includes examining the possible misuse of political contributions, according to some of the sources. The D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, before the special counsel's arrival, had examined potential financial crimes related to the January 6th riot, including possible money laundering and the support of rioters' hotel stays and bus trips to Washington ahead of the 6th. The financial investigation has sought information about Trump's post-election Save America PAC and other funding of people who assisted Trump, and that's according to subpoenas viewed by CNN. That's from Caitlin Polance. And I just a quick question, Andy, do you know J.P. Cooney, who's been previously and probably will continue to oversee the financial arm of this investigation?
Well, I do. Actually, I don't know him personally. I probably have met him, once or twice, but I have a bit of a history with JP. He is known to be kind of a public integrity and public corruption expert at DOJ. He was, I think, at one time the head of the public integrity section in DOJ, which is the section that oversees all the investigations of public corruption issues. He also, strangely enough, left DOJ, went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. and took over the investigation of me. If you will remember, after I left the FBI, it was a referral made involving the IG's findings, and the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office opened a criminal investigation based on basically nothing. It continued for almost 2 years until it was ultimately declined. They sent a letter saying they declined to pursue any charges because, of course, there was nothing to charge. J.P. Cooney played a role in that case towards the end. He somewhat notably brought the grand jury back after they had expired without returning an indictment, and essentially was involved in kind of the last gasp effort to try to get the grand jury to return some sort of indictment. They, of course, did not. And JP was, from what we know of the proceedings in a FOIA case filed by CREW, the Oregon's nonprofit Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. They were seeking documents involving my firing, and the department used the criminal investigation as essentially an excuse to not have to comply with the FOIA requirements. And they did that for a long time until Judge Reggie Walton held them accountable and I think actually told Mr. Cooney on the record that he could no longer continue to hold the sword of Damocles over this man, that being me, this man's head. So that's really my interaction with JP Cooney.
It's interesting because, what that reminds me of, using that criminal investigation to deny a FOIA request and get the truth out about what happened with your firing, sounds like, hey, why don't you just do me a favor, though, and just say you're investigating the Bidens, Mr. Zelensky, or, hey, Rosen, why don't you just say you're investigating electoral malfeasance and let me and the Republicans in Congress do the rest? Hey, just announce that there's some sort of an investigation. I guess we can't really know, though, like why Cooney didn't resign in a protest, or was he just trying to keep his job, or is he a bad guy, or is he a white hat? Like, I think it's kind of sort of impossible to know. That whole department was just completely weaponized at that point.
Yeah, it's impossible to know. And this is all kind of a lot of very kind of disturbing water under the bridge. But the question for us is, what's the significance of his role now in the special counsel team? Because that's what we're here to talk about. I think I have some questions about his judgment and motivations. However, the guy has a legitimate experience and background in these sort of white collar, financially sort of investigations. So I understand why he would have been on the short list as someone to oversee the financial side of this thing. The proof is in the pudding. We'll see how it does or what that investigation leads to or doesn't lead to. So we'll just have to watch it closely.
Yeah, definitely. Just an area of concern that I have. So we'll see how it goes. We also learned this week, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Special Counsel's office has tried to gain access to Scott Perry's text messages. They seized his phone in August. Now they've applied for a warrant for the information in it. And I have a couple questions. First, explain the search warrant two-step, because it seems like you should just be able to, if you get a search warrant for a phone, you should just be able to go in and get the stuff. They're taking a second step process. We've seen this in court filings. We've seen this in, previously, I believe, Weissmann tried to sue to stop them from getting access to the phone. And the DOJ said, hey, we just imaged it. We haven't even looked at the stuff yet. We're going to put in a second warrant. And there was really, obviously the courts were like, you can't have your phone back, dude. And we saw it, I think, with Clark, maybe even the Pillow Man, who had his phone taken.
Mike Lindell.
From him at Hardee's, and maybe Navarro as well. Talk a little bit about that two-step process. Have you seen that before? Is that new?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of something that's evolved over the last several years as getting data off of phones has gotten more and more complicated. But there is that initial step that investigators need to take, which is basically you got to get that phone in your hand. So you need to be able to convince a federal judge that there's enough evidence to indicate probable cause to believe that there's potentially evidence of a crime on that phone. So you can imagine getting into the phone is another issue, technical issue of getting past passwords or having the person who contributes to the phone actually provide the password. And once you're in there, then you get to see what sort of information is in the phone, maybe what sort of contacts and metadata sort of things that you can find from the phone records. But that might you might then want to be able to exploit that information or maybe access backup copies of that information that might exist on an associated like iCloud account or something like that, cloud storage. And then, of course, you need that second search warrant to do a more thorough exploitation of the data on the phone.
Okay. That's interesting. I feel like it's one of those button it up type things, too, where you just taken away another argument that they could probably use in defense. So I'm glad they're doing that.
I mean, you never want to leave yourself vulnerable to a claim that you went beyond the legal authorization of the initial search warrant, right? So DOJ is always going to take the cautious approach. They're always going to try to do these things as cleanly as possible to eliminate any potential efforts by the defense in a trial later on to exclude evidence. So if they think there's any question that they need additional authority to take that next step, they're going to put the brakes on, write another warrant request and take it into court.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm really glad you mentioned that you have to get a warrant. It's probable cause. And I want people to sort of frame this as, if you remember the probable cause that was necessary to get a search warrant to search Mar-a-Lago for the classified documents. They had to show evidence in an affidavit that there was probable cause to believe that there were fruits of a crime at that location. And so what that says to me is that they have evidence, at least probable, raising to the level of probable cause, that there's evidence of crimes on a congressman's phone. That's a big deal.
It really is. It really is. I mean, it's an incredible allegation to make. Seizing the telephone, the communications device of a elected member of Congress is not something that the FBI does every day. You can guarantee, I can tell you, having sat at those tables and had these conversations and made these decisions, you do not take a step like that unless you are absolutely positive that you've got your ducks lined up, that your evidence is solid. It's a very impactful thing to have to do.
Yeah, that's why I was kind of like, it's probably even more than probable, the cause, but that's the threshold when you're talking about these high profile cases. And Andrew, we learned Friday that just this past Friday that the Department of Justice asked Judge Beryl Howell to unseal previously secret court proceedings that have to do with Rep. Perry. They show the DOJ trying to get emails between Scott Perry and three people, Eastman, Jeffrey Clark, and Klukowski. Now, there were two proceedings, one in June of this year and one in September of this year. The Department of Justice investigative team asked the Department of Justice filter team, because when you see stuff from a lawyer, you set up a filter team, because that's what you do. They go through the stuff. And the investigative team asked the filter team, hey, knock, 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 can you prioritize communications between these three guys, Eastman, Clark, and Klukowski, and Congressman Scott Perry, please? Can you prioritize those Perry communications? And they tried to argue, the defense people tried to argue that they were protected by privilege, and the judge disagreed, and the Department of Justice got the emails. And then a couple months later, Andrew, we know the DOJ got a search warrant to seize his phone, Perry's phone. And then, as we just said, they asked for that second warrant to get data from the phone. But why would DOJ unseal these secret proceedings pre-indictment, like during an ongoing investigation? Like, why now?
Yeah, really interesting kind of series of filings here. So in this case, as you mentioned, with in the spirit of an abundance of caution, you're seizing the communications of three lawyers. It's possible there could be attorney-client privilege material on there. So all that stuff goes to the filter team. The filter team process was basically approved by the judge before any of this took place, likely in the context of the warrant request and that very first step. And the process required, after the filter team reviews the material and they determine that some portion of it does not include any sort of privileged material, they have to go back to the judge and essentially make a report and get the judge's authorization before they hand that stuff over to the investigators. So that's what they did in June of last year and September of last year. So the orders from those two proceedings were themselves sealed until yesterday.
Was it last year, or was it 2021, or was it this year?
I'm sorry, 2022. You're correct.
Oh, okay.
You're correct. 2022. So it's in the last several months. So yesterday, what you had was the department going in front of the judge and saying, Judge, those two orders, the order from June and the order from September, we believe that those orders can now be unsealed and shared with the general public. So filed on the court docket. Why would DOJ make a request like that? Well, first, it's possible that the judge told them to make that request. I mean, it's every single time you see a filing and, DOJ is the movement, it's not necessarily the case that they did that entirely independently. It may have been that the judge said, I would like you to file a request to do XYZ. So there's always that. The other thing is the courts, and particularly DC courts, they have a strong preference for not keeping things sealed unless it's absolutely necessary. And that's a good thing, right? That leads to greater transparency in judicial proceedings and more information in the hands of the public when it's safe to do so. And so clearly there was some sort of a determination made here that those two orders from June and September last year really no longer needed to remain sealed and protected from the public. And so they've been shared now in a slightly redacted form they're on the court docket and available to see.
Could the, not necessary to keep the proceedings secret anymore. So we're going to go ahead and unseal them. What would make these kinds of proceedings not subject to sealing anymore? Could it be because they got their second search warrant to get at what was in Scott Perry's phone? They used this material to get the search warrant, to get his phone, and then to go in further and get the data off his phone. So it's no longer... It doesn't have to be a secret anymore that we did this, because he's not been indicted. Nobody's been indicted, so it's not because of that. And this is a very narrow piece. It's not like they're going after an indictment here, right. But they very well might be. But I guess what confuses me is how does this sort of thing? How is it cool with regard to a search warrant, but also. Still, we can unseal it and there hasn't been an indictment. It's still an ongoing investigation, I guess, because it's such a narrow thing.
Yeah, each situation is a little bit different. There's a hint built into the order that Judge Howell signed yesterday. It's in the very last paragraph, bottom of page 2, which he says something along the lines of, essentially, the government will unseal further unseal, remove the redactions, essentially, and unseal things 30 days after it's no longer necessary to maintain the sealing, or 1 year from today, or 1 year from yesterday. So I think that shows she's leaving on the record in a documented form. She's indicating her preference that when you don't need to keep this stuff from the public eye, I want you to expose it. Now, what could happen to meet that standard of no longer necessary to remain sealed? It could be something as simple as, the person implicated by the search warrant talks about it publicly. Maybe they did. He told Talking Points memo that these aren't my texts, or these are fake. Somebody made them up. So maybe that could do it. That could do it. He in this case, he's the person. One of the people whose privacy is being protected. And he can talk about whatever he wants. It's not like an FBI agent can't talk about what happens at a grand jury proceeding, but the person who testifies in front of the grand jury is allowed to. So the same kind of thing. If you go out and talk about it, and then, it's no longer necessary to be sealed, then the judge is indicating she wants you to stay on top of that and unseal things as soon as you can.
But what this is probably not is the DOJ saying, oh, this is going to make us look good, or we want people to know what we're doing, or this is for the public's benefit, or anything like that. It's probably not that, right? I find that really, really hard to believe. It's not the way that DOJ operates. They're not, they don't typically get involved in, especially in a proceeding that's in front of a judge. It's almost impossible to imagine how you would argue that, hey, Your Honor, we want these facts out there because it makes our case look stronger. I mean, that kind of thing just doesn't really happen in an ongoing judicial proceeding. I gotcha. All right. Well, thank you for that. We'll be right back, everybody, with the second half of the show covering the documents investigation, where we'll be joined by Andrew Weissman and Ryan Goodman. So stick around. We'll be right back.
They Might Be Giants have been on the road for too long. And They Might Be Giants aren't even sorry. Not even sorry. And audiences like the shows too much. And now They Might Be Giants are playing their breakthrough album, Flood. All of it. And they still have time for other songs. They're fooling around. Who can stop They Might Be Giants and their liberal rock agenda? Who? No one. This ad was paid for with somebody else's money.
So, Renato, do you still have your own podcast?
Yeah, it's complicated.
What's so complicated about a podcast?
That's the name of the podcast, remember?
Oh, well, Will you still be exploring topics that help us understand the week's news?
You bet. But we'll have a new name because we're going to be working together to explore complicated issues that are dominating the news.
Working together?
Yeah, you're hosting it with me, remember?
Oh, right. Wait, does that mean our podcast is going to have a steam mop segment?
Let's not get carried away. But we'll discuss hot new legal topics, so check out our new episode coming soon to everywhere you get podcasts as well as YouTube.
Welcome back. About a month ago, a team at Just Security penned a model prosecution memo for the Mar-a-Lago documents case. Here to talk about the special counsel investigations and the pros memo are two of its authors, former special prosecutor on the Mueller team, Andrew Weissmann, and former special counsel to the general counsel of DOD and also co-editor-in-chief of Just Security, Ryan Goodman. Gentlemen, thanks so much for taking some time out to talk to us a little bit today about your perspectives on the new special counsel assignment, and also to talk about the pros memo that we had an opportunity to look at a week or so ago. So, Andrew, if I could start with you real quickly. You know, my own experience with Director Mueller's special counsel team was really limited to the very, very beginning, right? Working with Rosenstein to get someone appointed, and then, of course, working with Director Mueller and trying to stand things up, sending people and getting space and computers and resources and all that sort of stuff. But after that, it was completely hands off for the Bureau. And that was intentionally, right? We wanted you and your team to be able to have complete authority to direct and supervise that investigation without any interference from FBI leaders. So I'm fascinated to know, can you tell us a little bit about what it was like day to day working on that team? Was it like working in any U.S. attorney's office or a DOJ, or did it have a different feel to it?
That's so interesting that you said that, Andy. And I suspect that's both a reflection in terms of the FBI's relationship to the special counsel because of who you are, and also maybe in part sort of who you are in relation to who Director Mueller was.
Sure.
You know, because he'd been the director for 12 years of the FBI. So I think there may have been more distance there and more of a sense of, we provide you this backup and the assistance and personnel and all of that, but that your investigation is your investigation. That's not the way it felt on the what I'll call the attorney side. And as I've said, I actually have never had more oversight than when I worked in the special counsel. And I don't mean from Robert Mueller. I mean, of course, given the nature of the investigation, you would expect that, and we welcomed it. You want that. I mean, I had the same thing when I worked on the Enron case. You want senior supervision, but when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, you know, admittedly, I was in New York, where both Eastern and Southern tend to have this sort of, we never really want to hear from main justice at all.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've heard that certainly at the FBI side.
Yes. Yeah, many times.
The problems that can create. But I used to joke around that I've never complied so punctiliously with the U.S. Attorney's Manual, now called the Justice Manual, as I was in the when I was on the special counsel, because it's important to remember the way the special counsel rules work. You're part of the Department of Justice. In order for it to be legal, it actually has to be the case that it reports within the department, and there is that oversight. I do think that the Deputy Attorney General and his staff had a lot of reporting. I don't know how great we were at pushing back at that. I mean, again, I think that was sort of above my pay grade. I viewed myself more as a worker bee of, you know, dealing with my particular team and moving that along and having those issues dealt with somebody else. But a long way to say is that in the structure that I saw, there actually was quite a lot of interaction and oversight and give and take with the Deputy Attorney General and eventually the Attorney General's office once the Attorney General was no longer recused.
It's really interesting to hear that, because from our, I guess, fairly unique perspective at FBI headquarters, we had taken those steps to be distanced and in fact, to communicate to our folks, you are not to report back to your field office leadership. We actually assigned people to the team who could do things like approve financial expenditures and things like that so that people who were on the team didn't have to go back to their field offices for approval on things and wouldn't be routing their 302s to their old squad supervisor and stuff like that. So we just kind of assumed, I know I did, that the same thing would be true on the DOJ side, but I guess what I'm hearing is that it was the opposite. They were pretty plugged in, at least at the DAG's office.
Yeah, I mean, at the DAG's office and and then when Bill Barr took over and he was recused at the AG's office. We didn't, however, do sort of the more mundane reporting. So as under the Justice Manual, we did have to get certain approvals to do certain things, such as when you're going to use a MLAT, which is a mutual legal assistance treaty, and we're going to seek approval to get information overseas. There are certain people within the department who had to approve it. We did have to get approval, but the way that worked was much more. What I would say is at the worker bee level, it worked much more like what you just said, Andy, which is somebody would be assigned within that function to be our approver or disapprover, and they would make the decision, and it would not be shared outside of their office, so that we would have to comply with the DOJ regulation, but it wouldn't go sort of through what I would say is normal channels. To do that. So that sounds a little bit closer to what was happening at the FBI side. But what I'm talking about is sort of true oversight. I mean, and frankly, I'm not sure it's totally how the rules were expected to work. It is true, however, that the Attorney General at the end of the day has the power to say, no, there will not be an indictment here. This is not going forward. Now, there's different reporting requirements if that happens, but that actual structure, because we had to litigate it 3 times in front of different judges when this, because special counsel regulations were challenged, it's constitutional because Special Counsel Mueller was a subordinate officer. And just to add a joke, I mean, we had no end of teasing of the Director Mueller that he was just a subordinate officer, which, is not something he'd like to hear. But we joke around with him. But we were joking because he, of course, completely understood that that was a necessary component to this being constitutional.
Yeah, that's a joke that you launch at your peril. Yeah, depending on who you are. It's
Andy, I think you've said this in the past, which or maybe it comes from your book, which is as long as Director Mueller was joking with you, you knew you were in good graces.
That's absolutely right.
And if he was teasing you, then you knew things were fine. It's when he wasn't that you had to really worry.
He really only has one speed socially, and that is like breaking your chops. And if you're not getting dealt with that way, you're kind of getting left aside.
So I have a question. And this sort of piggybacks on what you were talking about. Well, first of all, I love the reporting requirements. It's one of the reasons I wanted a special counsel to look into these newer investigations in the first place. But along the lines of, talking earlier about like sequestration and stuff like that, I was curious. And then we've got a couple of questions for Ryan. But how closely, Andrew, did Mueller's team follow the political attacks, the news coverage? Did you guys kind of insulate yourself from that? Maybe, I don't know, podcasts about the Mueller investigation. Did you sort of insulate yourself from that? And I'm wondering how that might apply to this particular special counsel as well, because now they're expecting it. Now they know what they're facing. And I think that that's actually a big advantage that they have.
Well, we were in, I think it had been former FBI space. I mean, so we were in space where, unlike a U.S. Attorney's office, there are televisions everywhere. I'm going to leave the commentary as to that aside. So there was like a television in my office. I never turned it on unless there was some breaking news development, almost uniformly something about our case where it was going to be important to see. There were other people who, I don't know how they did it, just would have the news on all the time. And I just found that way too distracting. So I was very much in the hermit, sort of like just do your job because it was too distracting. I know other people, some people would just be attuned, like watching Fox News all the time to see like what incoming attacks were being made. So I think it sort of ran the gamut as to how people dealt with that. And I'm really sorry to say that when it came to podcasts, I did not listen to any podcasts at all, and I would say whether it was political or not, I mean, it was.
Oh, it was political.
Yeah, no. I mean, I didn't listen to like more, things to get my head outside of the sort of inside the beltway, just because if I thought being general counsel of the FBI was a full-time job, I mean, this was 7 days a week. And we were just very concerned about even being seen outside socializing, like going to dinner or having a drink. I mean, there's just an enormous sense of you were just going to be in this bubble, and it was very insular. And, I think also, having been on task force before, there are all sorts of pluses and minuses, but you really, I imagine it must be what it's like when you go to war. I mean, you really do become incredibly close to and trust the people you're with, because you're just living in this constant amount of pressure, and also you only have each other.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of a commonality in like crisis management situations, right? You always see a team that manages a really tough event on that 24/7 schedule. They become closer and faster and stronger and better the next time, but it takes an incredible toll on you as well.
Could I jump in with a question for Andrew actually on that? Do you think, Andrew, that the Jack Smith Special Counsel Office should maybe be different in that regard? Because you've written the New York Times op-ed in which you encourage them and Smith to be more proactive in reaching out publicly on particular issues that might be important to speak on. But I suppose he can only really do that if he's attuned to what is actually in the information environment that he needs to be responding to, or against what backdrop that the public understands or misunderstands certain things about his activities, for him to be truly engaging and conversant, or able to be conversant when he needs to speak. So do you think that would be also something you would think of as different with Smith?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't fault the way we did it. I mean, I actually think it's kind of useful for the people like me to just keep their heads down and not worry about that part of the job. But that's not a luxury that I to your point, I don't think that's a luxury that the special counsel can have. I think that the special counsel needs to be very aware of the public education and communication side of his job. And just to be clear, this is not a black and white issue. This is one where people have to be nuanced and keep two ideas in their head at the same time. And with no offense to anyone here, I take as one sort of life lesson that you don't want to be, as something you don't want to do is, in my opinion, is you don't want to be like James Comey in the Hillary Clinton investigation, where I thought he spoke too much, and I thought it was inappropriate to talk about somebody who was not being charged. And again, I'm sure there are pluses and minuses to that. But on the other hand, there's what I'll call the Robert Mueller model, which is not saying anything at all. And I think that you can modulate this in the way that Archibald Cox did, for instance, in the Watergate case, where he really explained in a really wonderful press conference that you can still listen to, by the way, it's a good part of YouTube, explaining why he was seeking the actual presidential tapes and explaining it to the public. Now, he could have just put that in a brief, and he ultimately did put that in a brief, but I thought it was really important for him to explain it in sort of very simple terms, and frankly, not something you would normally say to a court about like why you're doing what you're doing. You would just put your legal arguments in. And it was really useful for the public to understand that. When thinking through what's an example of what I think that Jack Smith could do, assuming that the former president were to be charged, I think it'd be really useful for him to explain not why he's guilty. I mean, that I think is wrong. That would cross the line, but why the evidence is consonant with all of the other cases that the department has brought, such that he is being treated comparably to other people who've been charged. In other words, it really explains to the public why this is complying with the rule of law, and making it also clear that the evidence has to be shown in court, and on all of the things about due process. But I think it's complicated. But I do think that, especially if we're going to go down the road of indicting a former president, if the public is not understanding what the department's doing, I think it's kind of almost doomed at the start. And so somebody has to speak. And as much as like this group is wonderful and really knowledgeable, that's not where it needs to come from.
Totally agree.
And also, by the way, the other advantage is, so Andy and I have been fortunate enough to work with Robert Mueller. He's such a wonderful human being, and so has such integrity. And I think, for instance, when Attorney General Garland speaks, he's in many ways, when you speak, both Robert Mueller and Attorney General Garland can be an exhibit. I mean, they show who they are to the American public. They're not household names in any real sense. They are to us, but not to the average citizen. So I think being out there in a measured way is going to be really integral to the role.
I totally agree with that. And I share your concerns from our past experiences, both with the Mueller approach and the Comey approach, which I feel very differently now than I did when we were in the trenches trying to figure that out. Although I have to say that it'll be a different prospect for this special counsel, depending on what the outcome of their judgment is. If your judgment is that you should not pursue an indictment, then you're really facing the kind of dilemma that Comey and the rest of us face, how to explain that decision without going overboard and sharing too much and raising questions that can, by definition, never be answered in a court of law. So he's got he's going to have a lot of tough questions on his hands as he goes forward, but he sounds like a good guy to get it done. So Ryan, I'm curious, as a assiduous watcher of all these things, and of course, with all the work that you guys both put into on the pros memo, I guess without trying to jump to the end first, one of the things that I'm struggling with a little bit explaining to friends and followers of this podcast, it's like, what does success look like for this special counsel? How do you as a legal watcher define success for Jack Smith and his team? Is it simply indictments and convictions and the normal kind of stat approach that we think about in day-to-day law enforcement? Or is there some other standard of kind of proof that we should be looking for here?
It's a great question. I suppose it's the catchword of accountability. And if indeed the evidence supports bringing an indictment, that he succeeds in bringing a successful indictment that results in some significant form of accountability. And I think at some level, even the indictment itself is a form of accountability, because it's putting the Justice Department itself behind that claim that Trump has indeed done something like put the U.S. national security at risk through the retention of highly classified government documents, which is what we get into in the prosecution memo. I do think that the measure of success, though, needs to be tailored to what the imperfections of our system. And one of the things that we do in this prosecution memo, I think that Andrew and I both believe is one of its greatest contributions, to be candid, is by comparing all the prior cases in which the department has brought charges for at least similar, brought charges for retention of national defense information. And I say at least similar because if you then compare them to the allegations of the reported information and the government's information about what Donald Trump did, his activities are far more egregious than the average case by far. And I think it's even hard to think of what is a more egregious case if you add up all the factors. So, But the reason I say that we have to temper what we think of as accountability and what would count as success is just, even though it is the case that the department has pursued accountability, has brought charges, we have to understand, the public needs to understand, in many of those instances, it does actually end up in light sentences.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it fascinated me that you guys did that, because that was actually, for me, one of the most persuasive final steps in our investigation of Hillary Clinton's use of her private email server. I remember asking, I won't share his name, but my primary contact at DOJ, that the director had requested a spreadsheet of every similar case dating back as far as they could reach, and just a comparison of the facts of the case, the aggravating and mitigating circumstances, and what was the outcome. Was that person indicted? Were the charges proven? And what sort of sentence did they receive? And when we looked at it across that scope, it was so clear that we didn't have the facts that we needed in this case to go forward with the indictment that everyone was expecting we would consider. So I thought that was a great thing to do. But I guess I can't let the discussion of the Pross memo go without hitting you guys on one kind of point, which would be intent, right? The wreckage of so many white collar cases, generally public corruption cases, mishandling cases, is always that key of proving intent. And because I guess Jack Smith's history with the McDonnell case and the challenges they had. This is, of course, former governor of Virginia, who was tried for a variety of kind of alleged corruption while in office, and case went to trial. Jack Smith was kind of overseeing that prosecution. And of course, the jury returned an acquittal, and largely on the issue, after being polled afterwards on the issue, they just didn't feel like the government proved that he met the burden of proof on intent. Is there the same challenge here? Are we looking at a situation where Donald Trump could, if indicted, essentially say, hey, I was following the guidance of my counsel and they told me that this was fine. And, I didn't even know what they were saying back and forth. And now I just, whatever. And you can't really put my fingerprints on this thing.
Well, that goes to one of the main drawbacks of doing this from outside of the government, which is, we only know what's been reported. My strong suspicion is that we'll be in a situation where, if there's a charge, some of the key witnesses on intent will be lawyers who said to the president, these are not your documents. They have to go to back to the archives. That you will have former White House counsel saying that. And I'm pretty sure that that's what they would say. I mean, these are reputable people.
Sure.
So I think that we may find ourselves in a situation where he may be able to dredge up somebody. It appears maybe somebody who's not even a lawyer, who says, "Oh, these are yours," but I mean, that's just not true. And he'd be stuck having to somehow prove up that he had a good faith intent that these were his. It's a little hard right now to see what evidence he would rely on other than his taking the stand. And I have to say, if he were to take the stand, I don't think it would go very well. So
I mean, I just want to see that.
That would be entertaining. Andrew, well, we know that when the Pats, right, Pat Cipollone and Pat Philbin were testifying for the second time after overcoming some executive privilege questions and were compelled to, answer the rest of the questions. They were kind of swapping back and forth. There were two grand juries going on at the time. And we can assume from an outside perspective that one of them was the January 6th stuff and one of them was the document stuff. So I have a pretty good feeling that the former White House counsel and deputy White House counsel did testify in this documents case and did tell him, hey, we told him you can't do this. So I'm interested to see how that all plays out. But just one other question back to this prosecution memo. Ryan, you were talking about all of the cases that you presented. And McCabe, you were talking about how people wanted spreadsheets of all of the similar cases when you were doing midterm exam. And midterm exam is one of the examples that they use in the Pross memo and how this is different from that. And that's why there was no indictment there. But I'm interested how you would think, Ryan, how the 11th Circuit's decision to vacate Judge Eileen Cannon's order because of a lack of equitable jurisdiction, they mentioned several times in that decision and in the hearing that we have to treat you like anyone else. And I think that sort of really, does that sort of bolster the Department of Justice's ability to say, look, we no one's above the law. We have to follow the law on this, and that's why we're going to do that. And do you think Jack Smith is the kind of guy that would go down that route, that wouldn't be afraid of some sort of political implication or something beyond what the law and the facts state?
I think it's such a great question. In fact, it's something I have even been thinking about writing about coming out of the 11th Circuit opinion. And to see some of the commentators out there, like John Dean and others, focus in on this, the way in which the 11th Circuit frames it as, for us to reach a different opinion, we would have to carve out an exception for a former president, as though there's some former president exception for private citizens. We can't do that. We have to apply the rule of law equally. And to me, sometimes I think that's such an abstraction. It's not really useful in a certain sense, but I think it is very meaningful that is a framework has gained traction. The 11th Circuit, a conservative panel, including Trump appointees, saying this, Attorney General Garland saying this. And I think, to me, at the end of the day, the way in which Trump would escape accountability is if that principle is violated. He can only escape accountability based on the body of evidence that we have before us if the law is not applied equally to him, if there is some kind of exception made. So I think at the end of the day, when Jack Smith looks at the evidence, looks at the law, it's just, some of this is just absolutely clear. It fits like a hand in glove with the Espionage Act, willful retention of national defense information. And because it's a special counsel, I also think that it's even more likely that what he will do is faithfully apply the facts to the law as his remit, then give that to the Attorney General. And then in some sense, there's this open question of what is the Attorney General permitted to include in a question of, threats of domestic violence or things like that, or political turmoil within the country, and the like, but not for the special counsel. And my answer to whether or not the Attorney General should consider that is no, that's the question of the pardon power, and it's for the president to decide. And Garland should follow through on his own principle, saying the same thing, that he will apply to the law, to the facts, and that nobody's above the law. So I think that is really essential, that does become understood as the prism through which we should evaluate the case.
And Ryan, do you agree that both for Jack and maybe even more so for Attorney General Garland, given his history as a judge, that the kind of exercise that you and the Just Security folks did in the Pross memo is going to be really critical, because it's not just the law and the facts, but it's then essentially what's the DOJ precedent for charging this? Because if there weren't any, I would actually be the first person to say, why is he being singled out? There has to be some good reason for why he would be charged when we have not charged other people. It's very much, frankly, as we did when we talked about some of the more lenient sentences that Donald Trump, if he's charged and convicted, should be able to point to as being potentially comparable. But what do you think that they will be spending, particularly, I think, Garland, a lot of time on DOJ precedent?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Because you could even say, yes, the facts fit the black letter law hand in glove, but we've never had a case prosecuted under that black letter law. But here we have dozens of cases prosecuted under the black letter law in which people engage in very similar behavior and far less egregious as Trump's behavior. And when I say far less egregious, just to be specific, not retaining the information for a longer period of time, not having as highly sensitive information, not ever receiving warnings from the Justice Department and from the archives multiple times that they needed the information back, not defying a subpoena to retrieve the information. All of those added up, and you have all this Department of Justice precedent in which they prosecuted cases with far less than that. So I do think it's the big question of treating like cases alike, equal application of the law. And to me, I don't want to put it too strongly, but it inexorably leads to a certain conclusion.
Yeah. And whatever that conclusion is, one seems much more likely to me than the other. You've essentially cut to the heart of what we were talking about earlier in terms of what and how likely Jack Smith communicates his decision to the country. That's the theme. That's this idea that we're all the same. We all get treated by the law equally, whether that the conclusion lends to not pursuing an indictment or pursuing one. People should understand that the process was fair and it was the same one they would be subjected to, which is really the most important thing in the long run.
Yeah, I agree. And I really appreciate you both coming on to answer these questions. I highly recommend everybody check out Just Security's Pros Memo. It's really great. Earlier in the year, Just Security put out a Barb McQuade Pros Memo on January 6th. And we talked at length about that on my other podcast. But thank you so much for coming and answering these questions. Former special prosecutor for the Mueller team, Andrew Weissmann, and former special counsel or general counsel at DOD and co-editor-in-chief of Just Security, Ryan Goodman. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you for such a great conversation.
Thanks, guys.
It's always so great to talk to the both of them. They're both so smart. They're both so knowledgeable. So that was an awesome discussion. And we didn't get a chance to ask them, Andrew, but I wanted to ask you about it. There was a contempt proceeding that happened this week where Jack Smith, special counsel, went to Judge Beryl Howell and said, look, I'm tired of this. We found 2 additional documents down in a storage facility. I'm paraphrasing, by the way. Mm-hmm. We're tired of this. We're not going to mess around like Nara did for however many months. I would like to hold the office of Donald J. Trump in contempt for not putting forward a documents custodian and signing an attestation that they've handed everything over. Not one single person is willing to, quote, put their neck in the, attestation noose, as it were. And so, I was a little curious as to, it was a sealed proceeding, grand jury, so we don't know much about it. That's the thing. There's limited details about what happened. We know he went in, he asked for it. She said no. We know that the DOJ is insisting that Donald Trump has additional classified. And we also know that that Judge Beryl Howell thought that the contempt wouldn't hold, which potentially leaves the door open for coming back later and asking again at some point.
That's right.
I'm just wondering what your top line thoughts are on this. Did you ever have any? I know that once you were, handed over the investigation, there wasn't a lot of FBI contact. But do you any other investigations, particularly with classified, where you had any contempt proceedings that were denied?
Not specifically, but I have to say, I've never seen another investigation quite along the lines of this one, just for this particular issue, right? The course of dealing, as they would say in contract law, is just horrendous here in terms of the government's requests for this information, that is government information, presidential records, classified information, and the Trump team's response, obfuscation, denial. Here's something, don't have any more. We looked, there's none left. Oh yeah, here's some more. It's really unique. I think that your instincts are right on in that this is an effort by the special counsel team, maybe with, a new sense of vigor and sharpness under its new leader, Jack Smith, to really kind of hold them accountable in a way that they haven't been held accountable so far. That said, the effort seems to have kind of fallen on deaf ears. It's possible that the judge saw this as, well, wait a second. We had conversations on the record in which the judge strongly encouraged the Trump lawyers to go back and search other locations. They did that. They found documents and then handed them over. So my guess is it probably felt a little bit to the judge like, hey, you're now penalizing them for actually producing more stuff. But, at the end of the day, I don't blame DOJ and the special counsel team for not having really any faith in the Trump team's responses and production on this so far. I wouldn't be confident that there weren't more documents stashed away somewhere.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like if I were the judge, I'd be like, look, if you have probable cause that he's got additional stuff at a location like Bedminster, then go get a search warrant, man.
Tee it up and go do your work.
Figure it out. Do it yourselves. Of course, again, paraphrasing and total speculation. But, Ryan Goodman, who, we were just talking to, he posited that it's sort of a sign that Jack Smith is being aggressive on this and not sort of pussyfooting around like the National Archives did for however many months. They went back and forth with this team, and then, of course, we had the search warrant, and then the Redweld envelope and all that back and forth that you were just mentioning. So we'll see how it goes, but it should prove to be very interesting to see if they come back for a contempt or if they come back with a search warrant. We'll soon know. And of course, we will be here next week to tell you about any news that drops. And also, just so you know, we are going to have an episode on Christmas. We are going to have an episode on New Year's. And the New Year's episode is going to kind of be a dive. We don't expect a lot of special counsel news between Christmas and New Year's, although he did issue
you never know
a letter on Thanksgiving to the 11th Circuit. But we'd also like on that episode, the New Year's Eve episode, to talk a little bit about who Jack Smith is. So I'm looking forward to that conversation too. Andrew, it's been great talking to you again. There's been another episode of Jack. Everyone, please subscribe where you get your podcasts. I've been Allison Gill.
Allison, thanks. I'm Andy McCabe. This has been a thrill, and looking forward to doing it again next week.
We'll see you all then.
Hi, I'm Dan Dunn, host of What We're Drinking with Dan Dunn, the most wildly entertaining adult beverage-themed podcast in the history of the medium. That's right, the boozy best of the best, baby. And we have the cool celebrity promos to prove it. Check this out.
Hi, I'm Allison Janney, and you're here with me on What We're Drinking with Dan Dunn. And that's my sexy voice. Boom.
Boom is right, Academy Award winner Allison Janney. As you can see, celebrities just love this show. How cool is that?
Hey, this is Scottie Pippen, and you're listening to The Dan Dunn Show. And wait, hold on. The name of the show is what?
All right, sure. Scottie Pippen momentarily forgot the show's name, but there's a first time for everything.
Hey everyone, this is Scoot McNairy. I'm here with Dan Dunn on What Are You Drinking? What's it called again?
Fine, twice. But famous people really do love this show.
Hi, this is Will Forte, and you're, for some reason, listening to What We're Drinking with Dan Dunn.
Now, what do you mean, for some reason, Will Forte? What's going on?
Hi, this is Kurt Russell. Listen, I escaped from New York, but I couldn't get the hell out of Dan Dunn's happy hour. Please, send help.
Send help? Oh, come on, Kurt Russell. Can somebody out there please help me?
I'm Dita Von Teese, and you're listening to What We're Drinking with Dan Dunn. Let me try one more time. Come on. Is that right?
Sorry.
What we're drinking?
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Right, is it right?
Ah, that's better. So be like Dita Von Teese, friends, and listen to What We're Drinking with Dan Dunn, available wherever you get your podcasts.
MSW Media.